Hello everyone and welcome back to Getting Started with World Creator 2. Today we're going to go over pretty much the same thing we went over through the previous Heightmap video, only this time we're going to cover a process to adjusting the Heightmap's level step strength individually per level versus the method we performed in the previous video. We will also go over a few other details not covered in the previous video, so let's get started. So as before, I'm going to go ahead and start setting up our terrain. So we have our 2K terrain here. I'm going to add area. Take the border blending up. Fill this. And I'm just going to go ahead and for time's sake make this 4K resolution. Has height map. Turn off the show blend. Increase the border blend so we cover the whole thing. Search for our file. The same exact file that we had before. Make sure it's 2048 by 2048, since I know that's what this map is. 16-bit, and flip the Y. Click somewhere, and since before, we'll make sure this is level step 10. All right, so we got the same terrain as we did, or as we started off with the previous video. Now there is something we didn't cover in the previous tutorial that we are going to go over first. That's scaling the imported height map to the real world data. First, in the previous video, we used the ocean level at 43 meters. So if we hover our mouse over where I believe we used before, you could see our observer tools over there says 43 meters for our elevation. Well, for ocean level, it's actually supposed to be 0 meters. So let's lower this terrain so that our ocean level is 0 as opposed to 43 as it would be in the real world. The easiest way to lower the terrain is by lowering the area's height offset, which you will find right over here under the height map properties. I know by trial and error that a value of negative 0.05 will give us what we want. So we hover our mouse over that location and the elevation is about 0 where the airport is. And we could double check this by going to scene, ocean, and you shouldn't have to adjust this any because it'll automatically adhere to the 0 elevation. So show our ocean plane and you can see this looks exactly the way it should. So we're going to just go ahead and uncheck that and go back to our areas here. Next, we are going to check the height of one of these hill ridges right over here with an approximated guess to what this island is in the real world condition. Now, Stratus, even though it is a map heavily used in a certain game, it's actually based on a real world island just east of Greece. So I'm going to bring up Google Maps here. And here we have the country of Greece and this little island of Stratus. Well, it's called Stratus in the game, but in the real world, it's not called Stratus. So it's right here, this little bitty island. I'm going to zoom in. Now be sure to hit the hamburger menu here, hit terrain. That way we could see the topographic data here. And this data is collected by a satellite imagery. It's not 100% accurate, but it gives us our best shot. So the ocean level, as we discussed, should be 0 meters at this edge. And if we zoom in here, each one of these topography lines should represent 40 meters. I could zoom in a little bit further and get more data after these topography lines. So the peak we're going to choose is actually this one right here because it's one of the higher ones and it's easier to figure out the location in World Creator 2. So based on these topographic data here, I could figure out that the peak of this ridge is probably somewhere between 290 and 300 meters, but we're going to round up and assume that it's 300 meters just for this use. So the location of this peak, if we go back to World Creator 2 and zoom in, is actually this peak right here. Actually, it's more like these two flat ridges right here. So our peak level here in World Creator 2 is telling me based on the observer tools. Let me zoom around so you can see it easier. It's telling me that this peak is 63 meters. Well, that's a lot lower than the 300 we need it to be based on the real world data. So to do this, we need to adjust our height scale, also underneath the Heightmap properties, as you've seen me mess around with before. This factor is going to be multiplied to the values of the Heightmap we imported. So the black and white values, it's going to increase or decrease those values based on this multiplication value. So 1 represents, 100% of whatever the Heightmap is, and we're going to adjust this. So how do we know how much to multiply this terrain? Well, we could just mess with a slider and get it to fit by trial and error, or we could just do some simple math to speed it up. We need basically 63 to turn into 300. So 300 divided by 63 equals 4.762. This means 63 goes into 300 4.762 times. So I hope everyone ever gets this math. It's pretty simple math. So this 4.762 is our new height scale value. So I'm just going to insert that here. So 4.762. F to go back. Now, since we changed this value, our sea level has also changed. So let's take this back down to 0. As if I hover over in the same region, you can see our elevation has gone up by about 160 meters. So to do this just through trial and error, I'm going to readjust our height scale, our height offset here. And through trial and error, I have found out that a value of negative 1.915 gets us to the sea level that we want. So we hover our mouse right over back here, and the observer tools tells us it's around 0 meters. Perfect. Now remember that peak, that 300 meter peak over here. It's actually risen quite a bit. So if we hover our cursor over this peak, we could see that the observer tools is telling us 301.64 meters. Close. So our heights are correct, but this just looks too steep. If I press F and go back, these ridge lines look far too steep. That's because our terrain's dimensions in World Creator 2 are 2048 by 2048. And I know in the real world, this island is much, much larger. So let's go back to Google to figure out exactly how much larger it is. So if we go to Google and zoom out, I'm going to just right click here on the left side, select measure distance. Now it's telling us to click another spot anywhere on here so we can trace a path. Just click anywhere. All right, so if we go back to World Creator 2 and zoom out and go up just a tad, we can see there's a little bit of the ocean here on the left and a little bit of the ocean here left on the right. So we'll just take this slider and adjust it so. I think there's a little bit more to the left than that. Okay, that seems good enough. So this is just a rough estimation. So you can see now that right here, it's telling us our distance is 6.25 miles or roughly 10 kilometers. So 10 kilometers is the new resolution of the terrain that we need to use in World Creator 2 so we can get this real world data to match up a little bit better. So we're going to go in here, go to surface, change our terrain width to 10,000 by 10,000. And you can see our little 2K area is still plopped over here. So let's go back to areas and oops, I unlocked it. So be sure to hit fit to terrain, click somewhere. And now our area has now gone from 2K to 10K. I'm just going to lock this so we don't mess it up. Now what we have here looks a lot better representation of the real world size and scale of the island. If we hover our mouse over here again next to the airport, you can see that it's roughly around 0 meters as we would expect. And again, if we zoom in on our peak, you can see, well, now you can see that it is roughly 300 meters as well. So since everything is scaled correctly now, for this tutorial and probably what you would want to do so we could see more detail in our terrain, I want to yet again shrink this terrain back down to something maybe half of what it is, or better yet, well, let's shrink this 10K down to 4K. I'm doing this for this tutorial so that we can get more of the detail from the real-time terrain generation in our video. So another reason I'm doing it so my PC doesn't hate me and burn up. So hopefully this video lasts through that. So I'm going to go back to surface and change our 10K to 4K, and 4K being 4096 because it'll work better for us in the long run. And we're going to go back to areas, unlock our area, make the terrain fit, and it fits perfectly as before. Go ahead and just lock it just so we don't accidentally move it. Make sure you guys kind of make a habit of that. Once you have an area in the position on the terrain that you'd like, just go ahead and hit this lock button, which is going to keep the terrain fixed. So whenever you're scrolling around, you don't accidentally hit a corner and shift the whole area to a different location, which I have done countless times. So I'm just going to make sure a habit of keeping this locked. Now, locking this doesn't prevent you from changing these settings. It just prevents you from grabbing the arrows at the end of the area or moving the area. So it just keeps it in a nice place, and it'll save you guys some headache in the long run. And now that we got the terrain fit, I just want to increase the resolution of our terrain so we can have a bit more detail to look at. Right now it's 4K, and I'm just going to make it 8K since 8K is the resolution that we used for the same island in the previous video. Now we need to scale these heights down proportionally to fit the 4K scale from the 10K that we had before. So we're doing this so we can keep our island scale proportional to the size that it is in World Creator 2. It's not going to be the exact size of the island in the real world, but proportionally with the heights, the widths, it'll at least scale correctly for if you have to use it in some other program. So to get our 4K scaled correctly from the 10K, I know that 4K, or 4096 by 4096, is, with simple math, 40.96% of the size of 10K. So our height scale and our height offset that we adjusted here under the areas and our Heightmap properties needs to be multiplied by 40.96% to scale the heights proportionally to the 4K terrain. I'm hoping this is making some sense and I'm not completely overwhelming you right now with all this math, but at least it's simple math. So let's start off with adjusting our height scale so we can make sure all the heights for sure equal exactly where we need to be. So what we need to do is we need to take the height scale value of 4.762 and multiply that by 0.4096, which is, of course, 40.96%. And that gives us a new height scale value of 1.9505. There we go, much better. Next, we need to do the same exact math for our height offset here so we can make sure that our ocean level is exactly 0. We could just scale this, but by doing math, we can automatically adjust this without having to look at our observer tools. So if we times that same percentage value to our height offset here, we get a new value of negative 0.7784. Hover the mouse over here, and our observer tool is telling us it is around 0 meters as expected. And if we look at our peak here, our peak is telling us that it is around 124, 123 meters high. So 123, 124 should be exactly 40.96% of the 300 meter peak height of the real world. So why do this lower scale and terrain size as opposed to the larger real world condition? Well, first off, it is better to optimize our performance here with this tutorial or with working in general in World Creator 2. Second, it could be a good idea to work at a lower terrain size here with a much higher precision level as we have did a minute ago, a precision level resolution that could also match the real world terrain size in order to get a vast amount of detail to work with. Then you could scale this exported terrain back up to the real world size in something else like Unreal or Unity. You just have to be wary of your scales and your sizes and everything while you're working between the two programs. But this is just something for our tutorial here to give you more detail to see, because otherwise the resolution of the terrain will be much higher than 16K if we had it at a 10K scale, and you're not going to see anything higher than 16K, and we need some more detail to work with our filters as part of this tutorial. So we'll get to that in a minute. Now that we've done that, let's get on with what I really wanted to show you today, the Heightmaps level steps. As before, by default, your Heightmap will import itself on level step 6. And with this particular Heightmap, as we've discovered in the previous video, being 2K, it is shown at its true nature on level 10. So if we zoom out, this should be the true nature of our Heightmap that we've imported. But we are going to uncheck this use level step checkbox here and then go over how to adjust all these level strength step sliders individually. Another piece of handy info, if say we kept all these sliders at 6 and then just made level strength step 6 here a value of 1, that is the exact same effect on the terrain as if we just had use level step checked and a level step 6. So I'm going to uncheck this and then recheck it. And the detail on our terrain is exactly the same. So knowing that, here is how these sliders work. A value of 1 represents 100% of the effect of the imported Heightmap has on the detail at the level steps resolution. So in this case, since level step 6 is 1, our resolution of this level for this terrain is actually 256 by 256. This is because, remember, our precision that we specified here on the surface at a half a meter is 8K. So when we go back to the areas, level step 11 is 8K, level step 10 is 4K, 2K, 1K, 512, and 256. As well as 128, 64, 32, 16, and 8. So that's an understanding of our resolutions as far as precision. And as I've said, level step strength is a resolution of 256 by 256, which is what is represented here. So it's taking the black and white values of your Heightmap and pretty much pasting that on the terrain at a 256 resolution versus the 2K resolution that it was originally. So say we now change level step 6 to 0.5, which stands for the terrain's 256 by 256 resolution values of the mesh. And you can see that represented here. So 50% of that low resolution is pasted and blended in with the World Creators generator. Now let's take the level 5 up to 75%, so 0.75. So with this understanding now, the Heightmap is affecting 75% of the terrain on resolution 128 by 128, as well as 50% of the values at 256 by 256 on level 6. Now in this scenario, since steps 1 through 4 are set at 0, then those resolution values are being driven by the software's generator, but not by much, since level step 5 is 75, which takes a higher priority over the resolutions of the first 4 steps. That gives the terrain generator of World Creator 2 25% left over to work with for these 4 steps. So level step 5, as again, is higher priority since it's a higher value. 75% leaves 25% to work with the generator. So the thing to remember here is if we had kept level strength slider all the way at 1 like we had before, then there is no reason to bother with editing these steps beforehand because it takes 100% of the pasting priority on the terrain's mesh. So be sure to understand that whatever your higher strength level step values is will have a higher impact on how your lower strength levels will affect the terrain. With all that out of the way, let's set all these values back to 0 so we can finally start editing what I wanted to start showing you in the very beginning. So with what we understand before on our level steps, I'm just going to go ahead and change each one of these individually so we can get an understanding of how these resolutions and percentages affect the terrain. So I'm going to take level step 1, which remember should be affecting 8 pixels of mesh across and vertically. So we're going to change this all the way to 1. Doesn't do a whole lot, so let's change number 2, which is 16. You can kind of see the shape of the island here. Let's go all the way up to 3. Now we're starting to get the shape of the island a little bit. Basically, what we're doing here is, instead of changing these from 1 to 2 to 3, which has the same effect that we've learned, we're just doing it here instead. And that's why 100% is taking priority. Let's check out 4 all the way at 1. All right, so this is looking a little bit better. Now, around the level step strength 4 is the lowest one that I'm pretty sure I want to keep at 1, because we have a general shape of our terrain here. And I know by editing the steps 5 through 10 at whatever values, it's going to shape in and detail our terrain here to match the height map a little bit more. So be sure to keep your strength sliders starting out low here and work your way up. And to get detail from each category, each one of these level step strengths, you need to have what I believe a diagonal approach. So from this point to this point needs to have some type of averaged diagonal appearance. The more detail you have at the higher levels, the less detail you will see affected by the lower levels, as we've discussed with our priorities. So it's a matter of you guys playing with the values to get the effect or the balance that you're after. You can do anything that you want, literally. You just have to be happy with the outcome or the balance between the Heightmaps step values and the generator's added values. But a good rule of thumb to mix the Heightmap with the generator's details is, as I've said, to have some sort of diagonal slope here with these sliders, which I'm going to do right now. So we're just going to take steps 5 to 10 and make a diagonal approach. Okay, perfect. So now we have a much more higher detail terrain here. We can zoom in. We can see our path still. We could see a lot of the general shapes of the island. And one great thing about this, as opposed to the way we did it before, the amount of detail on this ridge, because I remember us focusing on this ridge line here, is vastly greater than just picking one step. So we're changing all of these values to have, or to be able to see in our hillside here. Now let's add the same filters as we did in the previous video so we can get a good comparison. Now, even though I'm using the exact same filters as the previous video, I may have some different values for my filter properties, since we're working with a lot more detail here. So I'm going to go through those one by one. So we're going to go to Surface, Filters, Add Layer, Add Filter, and we're going to start back and go to Fluvial. And right off, you can see a striking difference between our fluvial that we tried for the first time here, as opposed to the way we tried fluvial the first time in the previous video. So I'm just going to go through as we did in the previous video and adjust a couple of these values here so we can get our effect a little bit quicker. So I'm going to go down on our higher values, and I'm just going to change this one to 50. I'm going to change 248 to 15. And I did this by trial and error, so feel free to use some different values. As before, we want to make sure we have height select so that our filter is applied only from the ocean level up. So we have height select, and we want our min value to be 0, which represents the ocean level. I want the general strength to probably go down to 100. And I'm going to drop the depth a little bit to 25. And let's just wait a sec and see how this generation process takes place. Great, this looks a lot better. Now I really want to, on these lower height values, kind of blend between the non-filtered and the filtered area. So to do that, we'll change the minimum value of the height smoothness. I'm going to just do this by about 6 pixels. Perfect, this looks a lot better. Now let's go and add erosion. So we add another filter, and we're going to do the erosion detail. And if you remember in the previous video, the erosion filter is extremely strong. So I'm just going to go through and change these values really fast. So we're going to change the general strength to 18, so it's not overpowering. I'm going to adjust the height values of 32 to 10 because I want the erosion to have a little bit higher effect on the overall terrain and not so much on the more precise levels. And I'm going to change the 1024 level to 30. And I'm going to change the 2048 to 5. Just so that we can have a little bit more minute, small precision there in erosion to help. Again, we want to have height select. The bottom range to be ocean level at 0. And I want the minimum smoothness, or the height smoothness on the minimum level, to be a little bit more than what we did on the fluvial. I want it to be 10. That way this erosion detail doesn't completely erase our flat airport, which it practically did when I did this a few times before. Great, this is looking much better. A lot better than our previous height map that we had. Now, if you're wondering what a lot of these settings are and properties for the erosion filter, I'm not going to go over all of these just now, but be sure we're going to cover the erosion filter specifically, or really just all the erosion filters specifically, in a separate video, because it's a lot to go through for the height maps, because we're obviously focused on height maps here. The third filter we used is the ridge filter, so I'm going to go add ridged. And as before, I want to make sure ridged is in the forefront of everything. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure erosion's the second one, because I'm thinking about this in a timeline. So for ridge, let's make the strength value 65, 70, that area. And as before, the height select, 0. And the minimum smoothness, we'll just match the other one and make it 10. Okay, this is looking a lot better. And as before, what we did, let's go ahead and add the final and fourth filter, which is smooth. So we can smooth a little bit of some of these details out a tad, since this island isn't this rocky looking. So for the smooth effect, I'm just going to drop it down to 20, because we only want it to be, well, there we go. We only want it to be ever so subtly smooth, not to take away too much detail, just a little bit. And here we go. Let's just take a look at our terrain here a little bit. That is looking really good. You can see our erosion here has actually cut into our airport. So let's, instead of setting this height range at 0, let's make it something around 6. Well, it looks like we probably need to make this height range a little bit higher so we don't cut into our airport, but I'm going to skip that for now. But you could easily add erosion to its own filter layer, add a new area, and then just paint where you want the filter to apply, or paint out this airport, and the erosion just will not apply at all to the airport, since we could create a blend map for that filter. But with everything, despite the airport there, everything else looks really good for what I was wanting to achieve today. The terrain looks fantastic in comparison to the original method that we did in the previous video. We could adjust some of these, like I could probably take the level steps 9 and make it match up with 8, or slide 6 back. You could play with these a whole lot more than what we've got here. This is just a good example, rule of thumb of getting the detail that you need. So now that we have our height map the way we want it, let's export this height map as a 16-bit PNG. You want to make sure you're on Surface and Export. We want to select our format as PNG, and I want to uncheck Flip Y. Export. Yes, because I've already done this once before. And now let's wait and see what we have. And here is our resulting height map at 8K. We could zoom in just a little bit, and we might be able to see some of our erosion. You can see the dark areas of this height map is where we've added all of our detail. In addition to saving it as a one map, we could export this as a split map, and you could tell World Creator how many tiles basically you want. So this is an 8K map, and we're telling it here to split up into 1K. So there should be 16 maps, but let's just change this to 2K so we don't export a lot. And as you can see, it's going to export all of these tiles individually, and it's going to categorize them so it's easy for you guys to import these different tiled sections in a different application like Unity or Unreal Engine 4. So, and I'll be sure to cover that in a later video of how to take these exported height maps and use them into Unreal Engine and Unity, and it should be a pretty fun process. And our export is finished, so let's take a look. And from here to here, you can see it's categorized our terrain and all the tiles from length and width and height. Just pick one, and this is one of our sections of the tile. So now that we have gone over how to customize an imported height map in a more fine-tuned way, in the next part to this height map subseries, we will go over some methods to having more than one height map on a terrain and what you could do to edit those in order to blend them together with textures, and editing the height map by sculpting, and see all the different effects you can have with more than one height map. So till then, I'll see you in the next one.